Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction, too. I'm still learning German. I just came to Zurich in January, so I hope everything was positive there. But thank you, organizers, for letting me speak in English as well. But feel free to ask questions in German, and we can figure it all out. Anyway, as introduced, I am a quantitative user experience researcher. What that means is I'm basically doing data science inside of UX. And that's different than data science in many other avenues, mostly because we're dealing with UX metrics. This talk is about what UX metrics are, why you should care and be an advocate for UX metrics, and two tools for UX metrics, namely heart and goals signals metrics. Let's start with motivations. Why do we want to even think about metrics? Great, there we go. 2-second delay there. I tend to start with Pearson's law. Now, Carl Pearson was essentially the founder of statistics. He deals with mathematical models all the time. Maybe he finds something there that improves. That's fine. So he comes up with this rule that which is measured improves. But actually, we use this all the time in our lives, right? So one of the things I'm doing in Zurich is learning German, right? I'm in this A1 class, and we meet twice a week. And so on Tuesdays and Fridays, we meet. And my teacher has this habit of, at the beginning of class, she says, hast du Deutsch gesprochen, right? Apologies. But anyway, she asks that on Tuesday. And then on Friday, she says, hast du Deutsch gesprochen? Boy, I'm so nervous here. And then, yeah, it's easy. It's easy for you all, I know. I'm just from America. We're trying to figure this out. OK, so and then on Tuesday again, she says, hast du Deutsch gesprochen? And then over time, I'm learning, well, I better start talking to other people in German, right? And so over time, I start optimizing for this measure. Twice a week, I need to be going out there to some sort of store and talking to somebody out there. Now, we, of course, use this in other pieces of our lives as well, step counts, goals at work, et cetera, et cetera. And the philosophy behind this is something on the order of Pearson's law, that when you start having a goal and you start measuring that goal, you can start seeing improvement over time. Now, in companies, we often see certain metrics come up again and again. Page views, clicks, uptimes, active users, and revenue have all come up at Google in several places. And what's interesting about these metrics is they hold a certain background here. There's a certain type of person at Google that's asking these questions. So I would say uptime is a very engineering-oriented metric, and revenue is a very business-oriented metric. And today we're going to be talking about user-oriented metrics. Okay? So a basic metric is any sort of algorithm that measures some sort of performance. And a UX metric is a user-centered algorithm measuring performance. In a little bit, we'll talk about heart, which gives you a starting point for these user-centered metrics. But I wanted to introduce one more principle first. And that's more troubling. It's Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Now, Goodhart was an economist during Margaret Thatcher's time period. And he was talking about kind of gaming metrics, that if you change economic policy to get to some sort of economic goal, you're kind of breaking the rules. And we can see this also at corporations. So for example, we could focus on 28-day actives. We could, over time, we could have some sort of really strong marketing campaign, and our number of users will go up over that time period. But what it may be hiding is, for example, that new users are increasing because of marketing and low cost of our devices, but our existing users are going down. And then eventually, when we get rid of an entire user pool, we'll start seeing this daily active user count go down. Right? So we also see this in other places as well, and some of the times the consequences are quite troubling. So for example, in news, if you focus too much on a click on a title, then you get titles that attract you to a news article, and there may be too many ads in there to even read it. So you're driving a certain behavior that long-term is going to hurt you, but in the short term will look like, for a particular metric, that it's helping you out. Great. So the solution to Goodhart's law is to look at things in multiple ways. And I'm really thankful that the organization had this measure twice. So it's right on your bag here, this measure twice here, right? That's all we're doing, measure twice. I don't know what cut once means for metrics, but measure twice makes a lot of sense. And all we're doing is we're triangulating here to get a better understanding of what's going on and trying to get an orthogonal view. All right. This is our first assumption, that there's user-centered metrics out there. And the second assumption is that as being people in UX and being influencers in our organization, we must bring up metrics. Because otherwise, other people in your organization are going to bring up metrics, and they're probably going to focus on just one. There's two problems with non-UX metrics. First of all, it's hard to understand it in a user-centered way. And second of all, it's hard to apply. So for example, something like revenue is a lagging indicator. Somebody's already made a decision a long time ago. We're dealing with user interfaces somewhere else. We want to get metrics that are more closely tied to our work. Great. So we're going to talk now about two tools for UX metrics: heart and goals signals metrics. HEART stands for happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. A few Googlers published an article in this about 10 years ago, and this philosophy has been growing inside of Google. I'll outline HEART, but also give a lot of practical considerations on how to calculate these metrics, what I've seen at Google, and then a couple of applications as well of key metrics. So happiness simply means people enjoy using your product. Now, happiness is a really good metric when you have a lot of different things going on. So, for example, you're having a really big update to your interface. You don't know exactly what to expect in your change, and there's just way too much to track. Maybe your metrics aren't quite tooled. You just want to kind of get a general gestalt of whether the user is doing better or worse at the end. Happiness is always tracked through surveys. At Google, we have an in-house in-product survey that pops up in a random way. And we tend to use that, but we also use email surveys for what we call dog fooders, people inside of Google that are trying things. And then also sometimes to external customers. Now with surveys, it's critical to think about your wording. What we've seen is if you ask a new question here, it's likely that you're introducing a certain type of construct in the space into the user. And then in terms of the answers, it matters if it's unipolar or bipolar, how many question answers you have, whether there's smileys before it or not. All these things are like little effects. So it's good to start with just basis of the literature. But how satisfied are you with blank? Very satisfied to very dissatisfied, 5-point Likert is generally what we use. The more targeted you can get on this question, the better off you'll be. So for example, if you're very concerned about, I don't know, latency or something, then you can ask that targeted question. In terms of analysis, we want to start with response rate. So what we see here is the response rate is just simply the number of people that have seen it and the number of people that have actually responded to it. In my experience, I've seen response rates anywhere from 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%, to up to 10% or even over, depending on how things are deployed and how obvious it is for people to answer it. You want to be very, you can use response rate and some of these other pieces to help understand what sort of users are answering your product. So it could be problematic, for example, if you're asking a user at the end of a negative user journey. So for example, a failure of a credit card transaction, right? That will always be negative, so you won't see a change in satisfaction over time. And in terms of analysis, we basically have top box or average. Top box is, in this case, very satisfied and somewhat satisfied over the total. And for average, you just give each response a number. So for example, very satisfied is 5, and then you take an average of that. Both of those have their statistical assumptions. I tend to prefer top box because it's very easy to explain X% of users are satisfied. All right, engagement. This simply means people are using your product a lot. Engagement's really useful often later on in an industry or in a product when you're starting to segment your users. So for example, you might want to understand your heavy users versus your light users. You now have a user base, you think they're doing different things, but you don't quite understand that. So the number of times somebody does something, so for example, the number of visits, separate occurrences of something during the day is a good example of a heavy user. And then, of course, time spent is a big factor as well. Now, for many products, a long time spent is a good thing, but there are exceptions. So, for example, for the watch, what we want is we have this tiny battery on the watch, and we make things really glanceable on the watch. So what we want is people to come back several times during the day, but only use just a few seconds of the time. So we create tasks that work around that. All right, in adoption, people are simply starting to use your product. This is the very first starting point, and there's two main aspects of adoption. I find adoption particularly useful when you're in a new industry and everybody's racing for their market share. You can start understanding how fast you're growing. There's a lot of questions here. You see a lot of tech companies that are growing very quickly talk about their daily active users and their user population growth. Users who started is simply all the unique users that have ever come to your product. This is a good way to look at how many people have ever even tried your product. And it's a good entryway into some retention questions you might have later on. Now, daily active users is simply looking at a particular time period and seeing whether you have a certain number of users. You often change the window as well. So down here, it says 1/7/28 day. What I often see in this data is there's a very strong day of week effect. So for adoption, for engagement, for retention, if you're going beyond 1 day, you often go straight to 7-day. And I tend to avoid 30-day for the same reason. Otherwise, you're just measuring the number of weekends you have in your analysis. All right, for retention, this is simply people are still using your product. And the calculation of retention is a little complicated, and it's complicated for a reason. So retention, the basic idea, right, is that the people that started at one point are still using your product. But we can't just look at this day over day, because if we look just at the next day, a lot of the people that there on day one are still there, right? So everything's going to be in the 90s. It's going to be hard to compare what's going on. In addition, even if you extend that and you just look at 1 day afterward, you'll see a lot of people that aren't there, but they're still using your product. They just don't use it every day, right? So often what we see is a start at a single day, and then a waiting time period, and then an end time period. This is often called XNX retention, what I call filter, wait, and then observe retention. We're essentially looking at all the users that are there on day one, we're waiting 21 days, and then we're looking and seeing how many of those users are still around in 7 days. Retention is particularly useful when there's a high drop-off rate when somebody leaves your product. So for example, with something like Android, if somebody buys a phone and they leave the phone, it's a high risk that they're probably not going to come back, right? Because they bought the phone, they have stuff in the Play Store, and they've purchased all that, versus something like Search, where they could come back anytime. And finally, we have task success. This is people are completing what they want to complete. For task success, it might seem like everything falls into this category. But what I've seen with user journeys is there's two main types. There's the type that has a specific goal in mind. For example, a checkout flow has a goal of checking out and payment and point of sale and shipping. And other activities, such as browsing the news while you're on transit, don't have a fixed goal in mind. And so you'll see task success be less useful at that time. Now, you could have a goal, for example, with news of somebody finishing an article, but whether they've been newsed out doesn't make sense. And with task completion funnels, what we've seen is that we want to look at the beginning and the end, but we also want to look at each step along the way. Also, it's very, very important to remember that, especially as your product develops over time and you have several features, you're going to have people flowing through all over the place, right? And so they might pop up in one step of your task, but they're not actually doing the same journey. Or maybe they're doing the same journey, but they're going to omit a middle task because they don't need to do that. All right, so why do we have HEART? Well, we have HEART for two reasons. First of all, these are a framework for UX metrics, right? In there are about 10 ideas that you can start with that are a bit more user-centered, right, in 5 categories. But the other thing we're trying to do is give some diversity to the metrics that we have out there so we can start fighting Goodhart's law. So in this example, revenue and adoption are going up. This is like your typical A/B study where some people see one thing, some people see another. Satisfaction has risen and task success has risen, but then it dropped down again. This is a very typical scenario for a rollout where you might have change your version, for example. Some people don't like the new interface. Maybe the existing users don't like the new interface, but the new users do like it. What I would expect is even though revenue isn't showing any change right now, over time, as your existing users peel off even more because they're unhappy and they're waiting for a better alternative, then revenue will start dipping. So your antidote, right? Measure twice. It's right there. 4 times in this case, right? So, okay, so now we've talked about UX metrics, right? And we've talked about them in the sense of being user-centered algorithms. Algorithms in plural because we're trying to counter Goodhart's law, and we're measuring performance because we want to have some sort of goal in mind, and we want the team to think about that goal, right? Now, we've been talking about the metrics kind of in this middle area, right? There hasn't been enough specifics. And that's where goal signals metrics comes in. Now, the idea with goal signals metrics is there's different levels about talking about metrics. The goal, your main objective. The signal, the changes inside the goal that indicate that there's success. And then the metric is your specific algorithm. It's very tied to the very specific implementation that you have. And with HEART, what we've been talking about is mostly at the signals level here, right? We've talked about satisfaction in a way, but you don't know exactly what product we're talking about, and we don't have a particular implementation in mind. Let's look at 3 examples of how Google has used goal signals metrics and HEART in our products. So if we think about search, search is really complicated, right? It tries to do everything on one page. But let's focus first on 10 blue links, right? You type in something, you get some blue links on the left, and you click on something to find what you want. The ideal situation there is users are quickly finding what they need. The signal there is the length of time before returning to search after clicking a result. And the metric that we use is long result click. So in this case, we have a threshold of 5 minutes, but depending on your product, you might have a different threshold there. All right, so this is within the HEART framework. Anybody have an idea of which HEART we're talking about here? Happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, task success. Yes, task success, that's right. Because we want people to get to the links. Once they get to that link, as long as they're not, I don't know, doing a big research project, they've gotten to the end of what they want to do, right? Now, search is also interesting, too, because, again, it tries to do all this stuff at once, right? So with the same goal, we could potentially have other signals in mind. For example, not clicking can be an OK thing on search, right? Because we have these knowledge panels, right? So if somebody finds the information there, then they're still successful. So it does get more complicated over time as you think about more and more use cases. But that comes with the development of your product. All right, our second example is an Android. We want users to keep using the platform. We know there's a significant cost if somebody leaves the platform, and they've probably made a strong decision that they don't want to come back. So we're looking at the percent of phones online before and after, and we're talking here about 121.7 retention. That's easy. It's retention, right? Now in cloud, instead of thinking of individual users, we tend to think of organizations or corporations. You can certainly have one-person organizations, and there are a lot of them out there, but when we're talking about larger organizations, they're buying into cloud altogether. So the signal here is the total businesses with any sort of activity time. And our metric is the total group activations, so the total number of corporations who have ever joined cloud. And cloud's interesting too because what we're seeing over time is companies are investing in several clouds, right? So knowing the total is really important here because daily actives is a little funny because people aren't choosing between us and somebody else. All right, so we've talked about heart and we've talked about goal signals metrics. There's a few extra pointers. First of all, choose any success signals that make sense to you, not only the available signals. And I see this a lot with happiness. So somebody might not have an infrastructure in place for deploying a satisfaction survey. But if it's really important to you, if you're running these really long, complicated things, or you don't have a strong metrics infrastructure in place, then you want to put that signal down as something that's really important to you, and then get resources for a satisfaction survey. Second, start with only 2 or 3 heart categories. It's very unlikely. I've never seen it where all 5 categories are equally balanced. Instead, leadership thinks about what aspects of heart and other metrics are important to them, and then they work from there. I've also found that even if there's a big focus on things that are outside of user metrics, like revenue, there's often a place for some of these metrics. Third, there can be several signals per goal and several metrics per signal. So you saw some of that in the heart framework, but what this means is that you can think about activations in different ways to understand it if one of the numbers isn't making sense. And fourth, iterate on your metrics over time. The first thing you want to do is get to a spot where you're leveraging Pearson's law. You're getting the information, and your product team is actually starting to build towards user-centered metrics, because that helps you as a UX team drive initiatives forward. And then over time, you can introduce multiple metrics, which will help you conquer Goodhart's law. So in closing, you all, UX leaders and everybody, must shape metrics because they're out there anyway, right? And we want to make our job good and easy, and we believe in users, and user-centered metrics are going to be more applicable to us. Second, what are UX metrics? They're user-centered algorithms that measure performance. And third, we covered 2 tools for UX metrics, heart and goal signals metrics. Danke vielmals.